So welcome to the, I don't remember, actually, I don't know how many, the next installation of the CLIMACT Ideas and Actions Seminar Series. I'm Julia Steinberger. I will be your host today. So CLIMACT is a joint EPFL UNIL platform to highlight climate research and teaching and to raise ambition on climate action. The Ideas and Actions seminars are every second Monday, 12 to 1. 2 speakers on different topics from the EPFL or UNIL or beyond. And basically the idea is to raise ambition and go beyond what is already being done. And we ask that you mute your speakers while we're listening to the speakers. Then you can ask your questions in the chat or in person. And the seminars are bilingual French-English, and everybody can speak in their language according to the Swiss tradition. We've already had 5 sessions so far. They're all available on YouTube, and either Thanos or Katha will probably share the link in the chat so you can find out where to see them. And today we are very lucky to have Sophie Wenger and Marlyne Sahakian. Sophie Wenger is, Dr. Sophie Wenger is from the is policy officer at BAHU, and she's a policy officer in the climate division and has been for the last 6 years. She's been working prior to this, she's been working mainly on emission trading systems and now on negative emissions. She studied physics at ETH and did her doctoral degree at EPFL. So this is a bit of a homecoming for her, a homecoming talk on solar energy. So without further ado, really excited to hear your talk, Sophie. And I will give the screen to you. And you have between 15 and 20 minutes, and then we'll go straight to questions.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you also for inviting me. I'm really excited to present today, first of all, because as you say, it's a bit of a homecoming, and I think that the topic I'm presenting it fits very well with the mission of your webinar series. So I will focus today on the Swiss long-term climate strategy, so the net zero target for greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and specifically the role that carbon capture and storage and negative emissions will play therein, and also, of course, discuss what are opportunities and challenges from a research perspective. So we're starting off with the long-term climate strategy that was adopted by the Federal Council in January this year. This strategy is based on an obligation that all members to the Paris Agreement have to fulfill. They have to deposit these sort of long-term strategies. And the starting point is the net zero target for greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Sorry, I have to organize my screen. So this was decided by the Federal Council in August 2019, based on the findings of the IPCC special report from October 2018 on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which stated that at least the CO2 emissions would have to go to net zero by 2050 globally. So that's the background. And the strategy says that for Switzerland, we aim to phase out fossil fuels as far as possible, meaning that in the building sector and the transport sectors, which are the biggest emitters today, we can basically go down to zero. And also in industry, we should be able to phase out fossil emissions very strongly as well. But even if we can reach that, we expect that we will have residual hard to avoid emissions by 2050, mainly coming from industry, the cement production mainly, so from process emissions, from waste treatment, or from agriculture. And there, according to current knowledge, we believe that for these emissions, we will need carbon capture and storage, and we will also need negative emission technologies. And also it will be very likely that we will also depend on international cooperations or contributions to help reach the Swiss climate target, be it, for instance, that we capture CO2 in Switzerland and export it to other countries for storage, or be it possibly that we finance negative emissions abroad and account them towards our targets. And the Swiss government also said, based on a report that they issued in September, which I will get back to, that there are huge research and development challenges in the field of CCS and negative emission technologies, where we have to set favorable conditions today. Below you can find the link to the climate strategy, which is also available in English. I would briefly like to sketch out the legal basis we have for the Swiss climate targets today. So we had a period up to 2012 where we defined our first Swiss climate targets, and then up to 2020, all in the framework of the Kyoto Protocol. Now we are in the phase of the Paris Agreement from 21. And there we have, as a legal basis, we have a full revision of the Co2 Act, which postulates that Swiss greenhouse gas emissions should be halved by 2030. And at least 3/4 of this target should be achieved domestically, and the rest could be achieved abroad. Now you're probably aware that there will be a popular vote on this full revision of the CO2 Act in June 2021. And what is also interesting for this talk is that this revision offers new opportunities to incentivize negative emission technologies. So that is by an instrument which obliges fuel importers in the transport sector to compensate for a share of their carbon that they import in the fuels. And before, up to 2020, this had to be compensated with domestic reductions, and in the future you could also use negative emissions to compensate for this. Then up to 2050, I already mentioned it, we have a net zero target for greenhouse gas emissions, which is non-binding so far, so it's not enshrined anywhere on the level of primary legislation or even the constitution. So we just have the government pledges today. But the government also said, in the context of the Glacier Initiative, that it would be willing to enshrine this goal in the constitution, but with full international flexibility. So this is a counter proposal, which was put open for consultation, and the government will now submit its counter proposal to the parliament in summer, which will debate this, and likely the Swiss people will vote on this in 2023. Now we're coming to the hard to avoid greenhouse gas emissions we expect by 2050. All these numbers are based on the long-term strategy I mentioned. So we believe that we will have around 12 million tons of CO2 equivalent that will remain year by year by 2050. It corresponds to about 20% of today's emissions of 45 million tons of CO2 equivalent. So the emissions, as I mentioned, mainly come from industry, and they are mainly from cement production. So it's not a lot of fossil emissions that remain, but mainly process emissions from burning limestone. And there we will likely need carbon capture at the point sources. Then another share will come from waste treatment, fossil shares as well, where we also need, or we expect we will need carbon capture at point sources. And interesting in the waste sector is that at the same time also biogenic CO2 is emitted through the burning of biomass. And if you capture this and store it permanently, then you have bioenergy, CCS, which produces negative emissions. And then finally, a big chunk comes from agriculture, from soil treatment, and from livestock breeding, where we will need negative emissions to compensate for these. So negative emissions being the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere and permanently storing this. Now I'm doing a little deep dive into this 2050 situation. All the numbers can be found in the long-term climate strategy. So here we have the situation that we have to balance these emissions of about 12 million tons, mainly from industry, waste, and agriculture, with carbon capture and storage and negative emission technologies. So we're talking about around 5 million tons of carbon that we have to capture at point sources, which is from fossil or what we call geogenic origin. So geogenic meaning coming from the cement production process. And these are not negative emissions, it's just a reduction measure. And then the rest will have to come from negative emissions. So meaning that the CO2 is really removed from the atmosphere and stored permanently. And here we expect to have a domestic share, where a big chunk would come from burning of biomass in waste treatment plants, which can be captured and stored and produces negative emissions. And the rest, according to our current understanding, would mainly have to come from abroad. From an economic perspective, it would be cheaper to do that there. Today, we think it will be direct air capture and storage technologies. Now, regarding challenges, we have one interesting cross-cutting issue, being that we expect that from the carbon capture activities in Switzerland, we'd have 6 to 7 million tons of CO2 captured in Switzerland, be it from fossil, geogenic, or biogenic sources, which will have to be transported and stored somewhere, either domestically or abroad. For these large amounts, we understand that CO2 pipelines will be inevitable if we want to transport these volumes. And today we do not have any CO2 storage in Switzerland, geological CO2 storage. So in the medium term, it's likely that we would need CO2 storage abroad. Now, I would briefly like to draw your attention to this report that the Federal Council issued in September 2020 on the importance of negative emissions for Swiss climate policy. It's also available in French, of course. So this was in response to a postulate by Councillor of States Adel Torrent, who who was the first speaker in this webinar series. And this report provides a systematic overview of the negative emission options we know today and which we believe are relevant for the Swiss long-term climate target. It also presents, according to current knowledge, what we think are the potentials currently, the costs of these technologies, risks, opportunities, and also barriers, and of course also research and development challenges and all the international aspects that are linked to this. And finally, it also provides possible courses of actions on the domestic level, but also on the international level. So if you're interested in this, I'd invite you to have an in-depth look. So just to briefly highlight the options, because there's not that much time today, we can distinguish between biomass-based options where via biomass CO2 is captured from the atmosphere, so that can be via trees or wood products, or storage in soil, or also storage in biochar, which is put into the soil, or also, as I mentioned, the use of bioenergy and then capturing the emitted biogenic CO2 and storing it long term. Then there's also the approach of using machines, CO2 filters, direct air carbon capture and storage, or also enhanced weathering, where suitable minerals are used to chemically store CO2. And here in Switzerland, there's one company, a startup of ETH Zurich. It's called Neustark, which proposes to store CO2 in demolished concrete. And for completeness, we also put here ocean fertilization, but this is not something that we're pursuing actively in Swiss climate policy. So the key issues are really permanence of carbon storage, which is not necessarily given with purely biological approaches, And then to, in the end, assess what will be the potential that we can really realize. In the end, of course, you have the factors of technological readiness, economic issues, ecological issues. Is it sustainable from an ecological point of view? And then finally, also political and social acceptance issues, the international aspects, and all this would have to be incentivized by a suitable policy framework. Then one slide on international governance issues on what we call climate engineering. Climate engineering in the international domain means, on the one hand, negative emission technologies, or it's also called carbon dioxide removal, CDR, but we mean the same thing. And the other category is solar radiation modification, which aims to affect the radiation balance, for instance, by putting particles into the atmosphere. So it doesn't have to do anything with removing carbon from the atmosphere. The Swiss aim is really to facilitate international discussions because we want to avoid harm to environment and humans, and at the same time incentivize the sustainable use of negative emission technologies because we will need them to achieve the net zero target. And there are many international fora and agreements that have links to these issues. The Paris Agreement, of course, but also, for instance, the London Protocol on dumping of waste in oceans, the Biodiversity Convention, IPCC guidelines, and many more. And we believe that there are potentially large government gaps that exist regarding these issues. And we also think that a lot more evidence-based assessments are necessary, and also discussions at the international level, which we're trying to pursue, for instance, via the United Nations Environmental Assembly. And I'd also like to draw your attention to a report that we commissioned, which was written by the EPFL International Risk Governance Center on these issues. So now to conclude, what's happening next? We are currently working on a negative emission technologies roadmap within the administration, where we more specifically want to look at the framework conditions that are necessarily, mainly from an administrative or also legislative perspective. We also started targeted informal discussions with potential partner countries that it could help us in the negative emissions domain, or CCS, for instance, when it comes to CO2 export to other countries and storage. Then I mentioned that if the full revision of the CO2 Act is adopted by the public, by the Swiss people, there are new opportunities also to boost these technologies or to help fund them. And then we also think that the debate will really pick up and become very interesting once the Glacier Initiative will be debated in Parliament and also more actively in the public. And what happens today already are quite a few research and also pilot projects within Switzerland that are very interesting and very helpful to move forward with the target. But still a lot more can and should be done. And there we think this is a huge opportunity for EPFL, UNIL, and the whole research and innovation community to engage in all possible fields. So not only technology, but also international law, for instance, economics, and policy development. So I will stop here. Thank you very much. Please contact us. We'd be happy to engage with you. Thank you.
Marlyne Sahakian is a colleague from the University of Geneva. She's professor in sustainable consumption. I've known her a long time, and she's great. So it's really fantastic to hear from Marlyne, who has several projects. So this is going to be reporting on the Energize project, but maybe you could just tell us a few words about WEFL at your upcoming projects as well.
Yeah.
So thanks so much, Marlyne.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Julia. Sophie, it was really nice to hear your presentation as well. And I'm going to now take us to a slightly different level, looking at the role households can play in energy reduction. So the key emphasis on reductions and sufficiency. So I'm going to share my slides here if I can. And there we go. So I should start by saying that as a sociologist, I have plenty of tools at my disposal to think about conspicuous forms of consumption. So why do people buy SUV cars and why do they engage in fast fashion? All of these things are relevant for energy studies, but there's a whole other way of consuming energy that's clearly not conspicuous. It has to do with the basic rituals of waking up in the morning, preparing a meal, checking our phones, checking our emails. All of these things consume energy, but they're not very symbolic or meaningful. And what I'm going to try and present to you today is a different way of approaching these forms of energy usage and thinking about how we can support transformative change based on a social practice approach. So before starting one of our European projects called Energize a few years back, in Energize, we wanted to engage in efforts or engage households in efforts to reduce their energy usage across European households. And before doing that, we went and looked at what initiatives already exist out there that touch on household energy usage. And without much surprise, we found that most of them, some 74, 75%, are dominated by the idea that we should be telling people to change technologies and products. So this is, switching an inefficient light bulb for a more efficient light bulb, for example. And the second one that dominates is changing individual behavior. So giving people more information, communicating this information to individuals, and inciting them to change behaviors in certain ways, usually through micro actions like turning off a light in a room when it's not in use. Now, much more complex, we found, were to move towards initiatives that support changes in everyday life situations, where we're thinking of energy as embedded in relation to everyday life, and also changes in complex socio-material interactions. So for example, how preparing a meal, an activity that consumes energy, relates to other forms of energy consuming activities like mobility. And these were much less dominant. So of course, what we wanted to do with Energize was increase complexity. And I will give you a little introduction to what we did with the Energize project, but also other projects that we've done in the past and are planning in the future. Interesting for people on this call, perhaps, is that in Switzerland, there tended to be a much higher level of initiatives on everyday life situations and complex socio-material interactions. And we explain it due to the funding that was available in Switzerland around the NRPs, 71 and other funding mechanisms through the Federal Office of Energy that create a lot more opportunities for interactions between researchers, practitioners, NGOs, etc. So why are changes in technologies problematic? Well, here I'm going to show you results from an NRP 71 project that I coordinated with Søren Erkman at the University of Lausanne, where we looked at household energy, so how people use energy in the home, and we found that appliances were doubling. So there's also data that exists on this in Switzerland. There are more freezers than there ever have been in Swiss households. People have more dryers than they've had in the past. And no doubt, all of these appliances are very efficient, but some of them are doubling in volume. So this American refrigerator that you see on the left is consuming 3 times more energy than the standard Swiss refrigerator that you would have found in most households some 30 years ago. But it is probably a very efficient fridge in and of itself. And we're no longer surprised to see these types of refrigerators in Swiss kitchens. On the right, I reassure you an image that is a lot less prevalent. This is in what you might call a more upper class elite household in the Geneva area. The double dishwashing machines. So maybe they're not being used at the same time, but nonetheless, this kind of doubling of appliances is problematic, even when it comes to efficiency, if we're trying to reduce overall energy usage. Another problem with the individual approach to consumption is that we've known for quite some time now that there is a gap between information and action, and between action and impact. So people may have a lot of information on environmental impacts. You can do you can check your carbon footprints and all of this. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to act on that information. And even when they act and feel that they're acting responsibly in ecological terms, the impact of their actions may be much higher than expected. So I'm just being provocative here and showing this eco resort in Thailand. Of course, flying to Thailand to go on a vacation has more impact than traveling locally, but people may be doing this with the intention of being a green consumer. It also is problematic for me as a sociologist when we propose initiatives that tend to over-individualize environmental responsibility. So it shouldn't just be about individuals making choices. We should try and make, let's say, sustainable energy choices become a part of everyday lives. And I'll give you an example of how we've tried to do that. Another thing that we found coming out of the NRP 71 project was that energy in and of itself is not meaningful to many people. Most of the people that we interviewed, most of the people that engaged in our survey of over 1,000 people in Western Switzerland did not know the exact amount of their energy bill. So is energy too cheap? I don't know, that's a whole other debate. But what we did find in this research is that there are many other things that are meaningful to people. And if we're interested in reducing energy consumption on the right there, through different appliances that people might use in the home, then we might have better luck talking about human health, comfort, security, connectivity, convenience, freedom. These were just some of the meanings that came up as being associated with energy usage indirectly and as being more important to people than energy in and of itself. So what am I proposing? I guess it's an approach I've been working on now for a number of years. This is work that I did a long time ago. Actually, I did my PhD with Julia Steinberger as my co-director. Very happy to she's my ongoing mentor, I would say, on all things energy related and more. And what I started to do in that research, and I'm now really continuing with, is engaging with a social practice approach to understanding not only everyday life, but how changes to everyday life might be supported. And here I'm using the example of cooling. So why and how do people keep cool in Metro Manila as a practice? In the middle there, a practice that of course is associated with a very energy consuming air conditioning unit, but there are other ways of keeping cool. And through this social practice approach, you try and understand phenomena and associated change through material arrangements, top right. So thinking about whether or not there's passive ventilation in buildings, what kind of shading is available, what kind of technologies are available, how they're placed in relation to spaces and activities. Bottom right, through a social practice approach, you would engage with social norms, try and consider the relation between cooling people and workplace attire, representations of seasonality and fashion, but also representations of cleanliness and hygiene. In relation to competencies and skills, you'd want to try and understand how people ventilate their home, how they create cool spaces, how they work, how they sleep, how they refresh the body. And we bring in social relations as well to think about how all of these dynamics play out in relation to the workplace, in relation to living with others, care responsibilities, etc. So through a social practice approach, we tend to say that this is at a level of dealing with complexity in everyday life. And this is a way of thinking of any practice, preparing a meal, getting around, keeping cool, any practice associated with energy usage in more complexity, and thinking about how you might change material arrangements, social norms, competencies and skills, or work at the level of social relations to change a practice to less energy intensity. So we've been playing around with the practice-based approach and, let's say, more experimental research action projects. This is a rather small project that came out of the the NRP 71, inspired by the work of Tulia Jack. We wanted to contest let's say, collective conventions, social norms around cleanliness and hygiene. In French, we say être propre sur soi. So to be clean is to be presentable in society. So we know that in Switzerland, there are these norms and standards around cleanliness and hygiene. So we basically recruited people in the Meyrin area, recruited 15 people. Some were quite hesitant to take on the challenge. Others were quite enthusiastic, a good diversity in terms of gender and age. We gave them a new pair of jeans and we asked them to wear the jeans for four weeks, at least 5 days a week, without washing the jeans. Of course, you'll say this is a pair of jeans. It's quite a ubiquitous, clothing item. It's not something like a shirt where you would actually see, someone is wearing the same thing maybe day in, day out. But what was interesting with the challenge is that we had a social media platform where for the first 2 weeks, people were very concerned about keeping clean, what others might think, etc. But by the end of the challenge, people realized that no one had noticed that they were wearing the same pair of jeans. They were quite comfortable. They felt quite clean. In a sense, nobody was dirty. And through the jean challenge, it led them to reconsider other aspects of their daily lives, laundry, of course, but also other energy consuming everyday practices. And actually a reporter just contacted our participants 4 years later, and one of them agreed to respond to her request and was explaining how she had a very pleasant experience and that it made her think about many other things. She doesn't use the dryer as much as she used to. She definitely doesn't do as many wash cycles as she used to, etc. So, okay, washing laundry, maybe not the most significant category when it comes to energy usage in the home. We wanted to tackle it because of the norms around cleanliness, but the Energize project had us thinking about heating in the home and how we could reduce indoor temperatures. So heating is more significant. In Switzerland, if you reduce by 1 degree temperature, you're saving 6% of energy. So that's what we did. We engaged some 300 plus households across 8 European countries, including 40 in Geneva. Here you see a household on the left. They had 2 challenges. One was to reduce indoor temperatures to 19 degrees over a 4-week period. The other was also laundry related. What I'm showing to you on the right here are thermostat readings for the living room. People were able to reduce their temperatures over the challenge period, continuing into the follow-up period. And they did it because it was a voluntary initiative, because we approached them in a way that was not prescriptive. It was about engaging in a pleasant way. And it was about changing their everyday life through practices and recognizing notions of comfort associated with being indoors. There were 2 sort of collective conventions that we tried to challenge with the heating challenge in particular. One was heating people instead of spaces. So how can we keep bodies warm instead of heating spaces that we may not even be using? And we also challenged the idea that we should be having some kind of homogeneous indoor temperature all year round. We really put forward the idea of microclimate diversity, and that perhaps in the winter we should be dressing differently than we do in the summer, but that this also depends on the activities that are done in the home. So I can reassure you 19 degrees was quite cold for many people, especially people working from home, but everyone was able to reduce by 1 to 2 degrees. I'm coming to the end here. I can't remember how much time I was given, but I'll go fast. The new research project that is underway now with Vincent Moureau, who's I believe on this call. Julia is on our scientific committee advisory committee with some others, because it very much builds on her Lily project. It is about trying to make the link between energy sufficiency and how we might imagine it in the future, everyday life, how it plays out, and well-being. And we're going to be therefore working with citizens in Geneva and in Basel to think about how reduced energy usage can also, we hope, this is the hypothesis, lead to people feeling safe, part of a community, living in an agreeable environment, etc. All these registers of well-being. And there's also another European project that I'll be coordinating as of May this year, which will be thinking about energy citizenship and how to engage people as citizens and not only as consumers in energy transitions. This is my last slide. So the summary, what I wanted to sort of present today and give you as a key takeaway is that we can work to change practices collectively. It's not enough just to focus on individual behavior or techno fixes. To achieve energy sufficiency, we really need to be thinking about how energy relates to everyday life dynamics, including infrastructure, skills, competencies, norms, all of these things. And that has to do with how we frame problems. Then we need to be thinking perhaps not only about energy in of itself, but how to achieve another normative aim, that of sustainable well-being, to imagine actively what it could look like to live the good life in 2050 at net zero emissions. So the normative aim matters. And finally, rather than imposing restrictions, because I think we've probably seen changes in energy consumption during lockdown measures, but what will happen after lockdown is relieved? I feel quite strongly that forms of self-limitation that come through participatory methods that encourage reflexivity are highly promising. We've seen it with Energize and other initiatives. So I think the process also matters. Some references in the end there, and I will now stop the slides and look forward to your questions.